Hi. The Southport Attack. Surprise, surprise, the attacker has been charged under the Terrorism Act and the Biological Weapons Act. This Islamist terrorist had an Al-Qaeda terror book and was producing ricin. In one fell swoop, he goes from choir boy, Welsh Christian with mental health problems to full-blown, child-murdering, England-hating, unhinged, radicalised Islamist terrorist. Despite airbrushing his beard away, it's now back. Nigel Farage is keen to take a lot of credit for thinking there was more to this story, but he should remind himself that there are, I would say, millions of other people in this country who sniffed a rat straight away. And for doing that, some are now in prison. I put a link below to freebie-grabbing mannequin Keir Starmer telling us a few months back, like the most vicious house prefect in a second-rate cut-price boys' boarding school, how the rioters were all far-right Islamophobic thuggery and would feel the full weight of the law. Many were fast-tracked into prison, including Peter Yates, who is now sadly dead. But the protesters were not subjected to the full weight of the law, because the law has become politicised and weaponised, mostly against the English working class. So it is no longer law in the sense of English common law, in which, all people are seen as treated as equal. There was an expectation that the feudal lord would be consistent or common in resolving disputes from one issue to another. Citizens therefore believed that laws were common throughout the land. Not now. It's now a tyrannical control and punishment mechanism exercised by a politicised Stasi police force and judicial system. Starmer, as we know, as good as instructed judges to severely punish people who demonstrated and to fast-track their imprisonment. It was a warning. Obey or you are in big trouble. Whereas militant Islamists, Muslims who, for example, attack and beat up the police at airports, are free to play the victim for the cameras. Two-tier Keir is not an insult, but an observable fact. Apparently, Tony Blair has been advising Keir Starmer, presumably on the essential skills of starting an illegal war, lying to Parliament and the whole world, fast-tracking illegal migration, making borrowing money magically appear as if it's profit, selling off our gold at rock-bottom prices, staying in Europe no matter what voters want, filibustering, destroying manufacturing, thinking creationism is a valid thing to teach children. The list goes on and on. But, and here's the point, one thing he was very passionate about was trying to bury bad news. If you remember, Blair's press secretary, Joe Moore, was thrown under the bus for sending an email in which she said about September 11th, when the World Trade Center was bombed, "It's now a very good day to get anything out we want to bury." But that was the culture that Blair created, smoke and mirrors and downright lying. So Starmer has been a good student. But it has backfired because, as ever, the political class underestimate the intelligence and good sense and logic of many of us. So Starmer knew the Southport terrorist had an Al-Qaeda handbook and was creating a biological weapon, and he must have known for some time. And that makes his high-minded demonising and punishment of demonstrators in the wake of the murders even more despicable. Yes, some destroyed property, and that's a crime, but their instincts that this was not some random murder but had a more sinister aspect to it related to Islam were entirely correct, as he knew. Their anger about the murder of the children was justified. So Starmer should be going to those prisons and apologising to all the people there that he's responsible for imprisoning and personally release them, because they were right. Essentially, they were right, and those who damaged property have been punished enough by now. The instincts of the British people were right, and we should trust our instincts and trust our own mistrust of people like Starmer more than we trust mainstream media. Even supposedly more on the ball channels like GB News. often insisted that the killer was Welsh and had nothing to do with terrorism. And Piers Morgan only ever reads from the mainstream hymn sheet. He ridiculed Andrew Tate for suggesting the killer was a radical Islamist. Will he apologise? No. He'll say he was going on what was known at the time. But many of us knew at the time that we were being lied to, yet again, as usual. But except, as with Blair, it eventually backfires because we are not stupid. I'll say this again, we are not stupid. It was all planned, of course, the timing. Wait until the budget, get Tommy Robinson in prison, then let people know the truth while they're distracted. But we're not distracted because we are so much more clever than they think. And the deeper picture here is that this is another example of demonising British people, mostly white working class people, but not exclusively, but mostly, and protecting Islam, because Islam is increasingly becoming the voting population that will ensure the left stay in power. Especially as more illegal Muslim migrants are allowed in and Muslims breed expansively. And behind that thinking is also that the big money is coming from places like Saudi. They're already taking over sport and religion and education. And this gives them huge political clout. And if there are clashes, perhaps violent clashes between Muslims and non-Muslims, all the better for the political class, because the non-Muslims will be tarnished with the Islamophobia brush and punished even more. Starmer is, of course, a puppet in all this, because if the Arab flag finally flies permanently over Westminster, does he really think that he and his little nest of cronies are going to be wanted? Of course not. As political puppets, they'll have served their purpose and they'll be redundant and discarded. And if that leads to greater global conflict, then all the better, because war means money. It's a great distraction. And the globalists think they will still be able to hold the reins throughout. Things fall apart. I've mentioned this before, but a couple of years ago during lockdown, I wrote a book because I could see where things were going, called Sometimes I Disappear. Main character is a woman who is on the run from authorities, but everything in England has collapsed. And at some point she says this: little did I know at the time that we would be approaching this state of affairs so quickly. She says, in the UK, protests became anarchy, and this became total war. The neoliberals never understood that many human beings just don't like each other, and that hatred is a powerful currency, especially if fueled by terror, and it outnumbers love by 100 to 1. Mostly selfishness beats up love, and I say that not because I'm a pure cynic, which I am, but simply I'm reporting it from the front line. This is what I saw, and this is what happened. It's surprising the neoliberals didn't know this too, because they seemed to hate anyone who didn't think like them, and their tolerance was a spiked leash to whip everyone but themselves. So they had a great knowledge of hatred. Their protesters demanded the liquidation of the armed forces and the police, which was the shortest route to anarchic destruction, and they had considerable success. Once everything was looted and stolen, there was only each other to turn on and claw the face from. Mosques and churches torched, and then all our pitch battles on the streets between Muslim groups and mostly poor whites who felt dispossessed. Black vigilante groups and East European gangs embroiled in their own street wars, mostly to control the drug and prostitution markets that had become the biggest economy by far. Black Lives Matter became No Lives Matter in pitched battles, and everywhere the shadow of the virus and fueling more fear and destruction. The police seemed paralysed. Military bases were taken by surprise at the vigilance of groups from all sides, and soldiers either joined one or other faction or died, as all the hardware the army owned was stolen and distributed. The virus and the vaccination programme had created a climate of fear and lockdown, so most people took to their homes and hoped the storm would pass. Instead, it destroyed many of them. As the body count rose, all the major institutions collapsed, and healthcare, law and order disappeared. Governance was done with. Dorado, which is the capital, had a paid hardcore of ex-army and police employed by the super rich, who boarded up, and their hired soldiers became protectors and created the city that now is, or was until we blew the lid off it, with an elite at its centre. The protectors were surprisingly effective at destroying opposition. They had organisation and guerrilla tactics, whereas the rival gangs and impromptu armies had only murderous intent and improvised chaotic slaughter. Society was now officially a shambles. If you like this, do please share and subscribe, and I put the links to other talks below, and the Keir Starmer link and a link to my book. Thank you.